Hey folks, Pronago bringing you the Warlords Battlecry review. Taking a look at this game after so many years of not playing it. I think the last time that I played it, I was 12, by the way. So it was a long time ago that I had last set my eyes on this franchise overall, but especially on this particular title. I forgot a lot about the narrative. A lot of the things that I thought I remembered from individual missions was embellished by nostalgia and by distance. And so it was very illuminating to play it again. Very interesting. Certainly something where, especially when you are the kind of person that I am, where I really like getting things down to the nitty gritty. I think about things a lot, maybe too much, in terms of my analysis of video games as more of an expression of like some sort of creative expression, I guess. When I see games like this that are very campy, very old, they don't age very well. That's certainly something you can say about this particular title. It's very interesting to me to think about the developer's intent. And one of the things that I think is interesting is a larger conversation about reverse engineering developer intent from their production. I think when things don't age well, part of that is you not being able to reverse engineer their intent. And it's a very different thing than not being able to do that from a title that was just released. Because there's always going to be something where it's couched in the modern era. It's couched in modern standards, unless somebody's just completely unaware or willfully ignoring modern standards for some particular reason. Then maybe it sort of straddles that line. But I feel like there's something about Warlords Battlecry overall where you know that the reason why you're unable to understand what the intention of the developer was is not because it's necessarily a bad production overall, although I do think it generally is, but it's because the decisions themselves puzzle you, and the reason why there's the disconnect between the developer's philosophy and your philosophy as a modern gamer is precisely because the stuff that they're doing doesn't make any sense in the modern era. And that's where I think you get things that don't age very well. So it's sort of like a subtle, almost, hair-splitting kind of point, semantic kind of argument. But I feel like it's an important thing to establish early on, because a lot of this review is going to be talking about things like the very campy narrative, things that don't really make a lot of sense, things that don't feel properly expressed and explained or communicated in some way. And, be it the narrative, the presentation, the gameplay, all these elements have a lot of things that just don't hold up to modern standards. And it's hard to say that that's a heinous act, because obviously a title that was made in the year 2000 like this is not necessarily going to be future proof. And especially since it didn't have the funding of a AAA studio back then, because gaming was very much not something that people put a lot of money into. It wasn't until, later on, console generations and stuff like that, where we really saw a lot of money being thrown into titles for their development. It's not the same thing as like movies, for example, right? It's very much a budding industry even back then, and I would say it's still a very young one right now. And so, as a result, you don't really see a lot of future-proofing that as an intentional part of a developer's design philosophy, or integral part of a developer's design philosophy. Whereas now you see all these games as a service that are designed to be around for as long as they can be financially solvent. You see League of Legends, a game that was released, I don't even know when, 2011 maybe? It was a long time ago, and it wants to be longer than 10 years running. World of Warcraft, way longer than 10 years running, right? That was like 2004 or 2005 or something. So, still going now. And so you see these games as a service now that are designed, in theory, they're designed to be future-proof. And, Warlords Battlecry is obviously not something that even purports to be that, let alone actually attempted to be that. So, very interesting title, though. Very interesting. Maybe it's just because, I imagine it's almost certainly because of the fact that I was nostalgic for it, that I was something that I had past experience with. That's probably the main reason why it was interesting to revisit it now with my modern standards, with my modern lenses that I view art and productions, works through. And so that's where we stand with Warlords Battlecry. That's where we stand with the title overall. It's quite an interesting trip down memory lane with just your modern standards. So, like I said, the story is definitely very campy. It's one of those things where you have your cutscenes being narrated to you. That's one thing, but when you're supposed to be like your character is the subject of the narration, and the narration is explaining your motivations, your feelings, your thought processes when it comes to the thoughts behind your actions or whatever, and you're not actually choosing anything yet. Obviously, I'm speaking mostly of the Alana death cutscene at the end of chapter 3. That I thought was really bizarre. Like, when you have something like that where, especially, there is a choice one way or the other, it doesn't feel like the narration informs you of the meaning, like the motivations you would have behind that choice. It feels like it's almost like something that would play after you've already made your choice, except it includes both, results or whatever, motivations for both decisions. And I also think that another part of that is the fact that all of the development of characters, for one, has nothing to do with you, but it occurs within the characters that are presented, like that you have an immediate line of sight of, basically. Like, the knight walking around you, Minos being there on the field of battle, and, Robert as well, and whoever else. You have all of these people who, they basically, the way that they are working in essence is that these characters develop or grow in some way. At least they seem to react to the world around them, even if they don't actually grow as characters. But you will only ever see dialogue between those characters, and sometimes yourself, but mostly just between them, one another. You'll never see your enemy, an antagonist. You don't really have an antagonist in this campaign. You'll never see an enemy leader speak to you or taunt you or do anything that implies any degree of personality. Certainly not the way that they play. The way that they play does not have any degree of personality in it. You just have the idea of like, hey, I'm an AI with a preset build order, infinite money, and or at least a really high amount of starting money, and potentially even reduced build times. I didn't get to the bottom of whether or not that was actually the case, but it certainly felt like that on the hard difficulty, that they had much shorter build times than you did. And so when you have a situation like that, there's never going to be a gameplay expression of the AI's personality. And so when you combine that with the fact that the AI enemies never actually had any degree of expression through dialogue or through a more traditional narrative device, that, obviously narratives in games are usually pretty disconnected from one another because of the fact that they have this very hard separation of the narrative and cutscenes drive the story forward, and then the gameplay is just something that you play as opposed to the gameplay telling a story. But you didn't really ever have any expression of the enemies because the AI felt very cookie cutter and obviously cheated, and there was no dialogue, there was no presence of them in cutscenes, really. There was nothing. It was actually a very weird kind of absentee sort of narrative where a lot of it just felt empty. A lot of the story felt like, the gameplay rather, felt very much like filler, and then the story would pick up almost like time traveling weeks or days or whatever ahead of where your mission just ended. It very much felt disconnected. So I'm not really sure again, that's another thing where it feels like this could be the game not aging well, but I think it's probably a bit more likely in this particular case, when it comes to the narrative feeling very disconnected from the gameplay and just from itself in general, that this is just shoddy, craftsmanship in that respect. It's just poor design, poor execution, as opposed to being something like, it's a tactic that would work back then. I guess it is in the sense that it was acceptable for stories to have no effort put into them back then, but nowadays it's not. And that's just because of how we've evolved as gamers, as consumers of video games. So an interesting kind of discussion to have, but ultimately I feel like the story really failed to do anything. The setting as well was never really properly characterized. I think all of the things that were interesting about the setting, like the essentially like the origin stories of a lot of the factions that you see. Like, I think maybe that's interesting, or could be potentially interesting, has potential. I think a lot of that just comes from the fact that the game didn't explore that. And if the game had explored that, I have a feeling that it would have been done poorly, and as a result would not have felt interesting or potentially interesting. So that's kind of like a double-edged sword where it's like, yeah, the things that I liked about your narrative and setting were things that you didn't actually explore. And I feel like if you had explored them, I would not have liked them. And that's sort of how I feel coming running away from it. But it's very much a strange type of game where the narrative feels tacked on, but at the same time, it's not just that it's tacked on. It's somehow floating there, loosely attached and loosely connected to what you're doing in the game, but also commanding what you're allowed to do in the game, where you'd have missions that are no building, and you have missions that are heavily skewed one way in terms of the playstyles that you're able to use and the skills that you're able to express, given some weak story context or whatever. So it commands the gameplay, but also doesn't feel like it informs the gameplay. Like it just mandates certain things, but then also doesn't characterize anything within that experience. So it's a very weird kind of story, a very weird kind of title, and the campaign definitely fails to impress in that respect. But is also it doesn't fail to puzzle. It certainly puzzles. It has that in spades. So the only other thing that I would have to say about the narrative is that there were individual characters that felt really stupid. The knight, I don't really understand what was going on with that guy. I don't know his name. I forget his name entirely. But he has some peculiar lines. Like, you lead this successful military campaign by his request, by his order, to, reclaim the white gem, whatever it's like the Tears of Dawn or something. So like the white tear of dawn. You bring that back, and you've done this. You've destroyed the dark elves, and you've done all this stuff, right? You've certainly achieved things that he like. You think that should be something that he respects, right? In general, you think that you should have gained his respect in some respect. No pun intended. And yet his first and only question that he has of you is not like, how are you holding up, or not to congratulate you on your military victory, on your successful campaign in the Dark Elven lands. It's just immediately, what the fuck are you doing with that elf, and why did you do that? Like, you're not worth my sight. Get out of here. I don't want you in my unit at all. And like, I don't even know that he would have the jurisdiction to successfully kick you out. Like, he's a knight, right? Or the leader of the knightly order or whatever. I don't think he's like the king or whatever. I don't know if the Guardia even has a monarch, but he seems like the only authority figure we're ever exposed to. Sure. And he's certainly your boss, but I don't know if he's able to give orders like that, where he literally expels an entire unit, who then wordlessly follow you and fight their own people, by the way. That was a very turbo moi kind of mission. I have nothing to say about that one overall. It's just very bizarre. So, aside from the knight, I felt like a lot of the other characters were a little cringy, or at the very least, not presented very well. I thought Robert was, his motivations, I guess the best way to describe it is like, Minos is an extreme caricature of the typical guy who follows the orders of the leader and is loyal only to the leader, right? Like, he doesn't really have much character to him. He's just the lackey of the knight, right? But in a way where he also tries to command respect. Like, he dislikes the other party members and follows the king's orders, basically, right? Or the knight's orders. And so, like, okay, that's Minos. Then you've got Robert, who, like, quips at Minos, but doesn't really seem too convicted of any one thing until he demands that you come with him in the evil campaign, and then doesn't have any compunctions against killing dwarves and humans with the help of orcs, like helping orcs directly and fighting alongside them. Like, this is very bizarre. And so it's just a very like schizophrenic kind of characterization of a lot of the characters. They very much kowtowed to the plot, right? Like the story arcs that were laid in the ground, like firmly cemented, like you do this in chapter 1 and this in chapter 2 and this in chapter 3 and so on and so forth. And like the bad version in chapter 4 and chapter 5 do this, and the good version do that, and so on. You get the idea. You have these story arcs, you have these plots, right, that you follow, and the characters seem to just wildly change depending on whatever the plot needs them to say. They say what the story writers demand that they say, with no real regard to whether or not their characters are intact at the end of that line. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. I feel like it was just more lackluster design, poor craftsmanship. So I guess we can talk about the presentation, like the art, sound, etc., before moving on to the gameplay, which is where the meat of the review will actually be. Sound, I think it's pretty bad, honestly. It's not quite as bad as Armies of Exego, but the combat effects are heavily recycled, so you'll have like a lot of the same, like for example, the Basilisk and the Dryad, two units that could not be further apart, besides the fact that they're ranged and shoot missiles, right? They use the same sound effects for impacts and for the firing sound, even though they use different projectiles. And so that's really confusing. Obviously, the other issue is that almost every single impact sound with a building is the same, is identical. Like the arrow impact sound is the same as the Dryad missile impact sound is the same as the Basilisk missile impact sound is the same as everything else, right? Everything is always that sound, which is not at all what it sounds like, but whatever. I can't make sound effects. So there's just so many effects that are recycled across multiple races, multiple units per race use the same set of sound effects for combat. It really interferes with your ability to understand what's going on a, like, especially since, like, I think, well, I actually don't remember where this was first reported or where I found it being reported, but I'm pretty sure you can Google this and fact check me, that people do actively, there are people out there who interpret sound effects, audio cues. They react to them faster than they react to visual cues. And it might even be like a 50-50 split, but there are people out there who do that. And if you want your game to be playable in a way where it just makes sense, right? It's not confusing, especially things that shouldn't be confusing, like sounds, then you want to make sure that your sounds are distinct from one another and are not being recycled, right? So I think that's pretty obvious now, but apparently it wasn't to SSG, who made the game. Aside from that, the main thing that jumps off the page as soon as you listen to this game is the music. It really varies wildly, not just in like the actual volume of the sound files, but the loudness, like their presence in the soundstage. And so sometimes it'll be like in the background where it should be, in my opinion, just accentuating the action in some way, like accenting it in a way where it makes you feel of a certain theme. Like, you know, if you have a dark, moody kind of sound design for the music, or if this is the kind of theme that you want to impart, then the music should accentuate that, but not necessarily personify it entirely, right? It really should just be a supporting column in the overall construction of your whatever story you're trying to tell, right? It's just to reinforce something. At least that's how I would do it for something like an RTS, where the music really shouldn't be in your face. And yet this music will range from doing that to being very much in your face, just dominating everything else, all of the other frequencies, etc. And so it's really, really disastrous for the soundstage, I would say. And of course, another issue is that unit responses play over one another over again ad infinitum. So that really hampers the experience of, you know, I guess besides Grant, if you really like Grant going, Grant coming through, then you'll enjoy this game. But aside from that, it's forward, 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 forward. Come the fuck on, man. You'd think that would have been caught by somebody. I don't even know if that's fixed in some of the other later games. I guess we'll find out. Oh, man. Then the last thing I'll talk about with the sound effects are the fact that a lot of them are from commercial CDs, and they don't have very much editing. This is very obvious with the dragon sound effects in the opening cutscene that are taken from the same place that Blizzard took their sound effects. And so since Blizzard also didn't edit them very much in that respect for Warcraft 3, you basically get this issue where it might not be too bad within the context of a single title, but it really makes your game, it lacks a certain element of uniqueness. It doesn't stand out amongst the rank and file of other titles that use the same sound effects and don't do any editing. And so, you know, commercial CDs are a resource like any other, but you really have to make those sound effects your own, because there are going to be a lot of bozos out there who take these sound effects and do nothing with them and just slap them into their project without any editing. And so I feel like really there should have been some more effort put into the sound design overall, but especially when it comes to, you know, taking stuff from commercial CDs, taking stuff from these resource libraries and saying, okay, you know, we have access to these, but we really got to make them our own. We really got to make them belong in our game, as opposed to just being very disconnected, but also as opposed to making it so that our game sounds like every other fucking game out there. You got to have some element of personality, and one thing that this game really lacks is that, especially in terms of the sound staging. I thought the voice acting was okay. Not really much to say on it. There's some samples that are a little gay, but for the most part, I think they're all right. And so, you know, when the music is dominating my fucking sound range, and when the sound effects are overlapping and recycling and whatever, just boring, then there's not much to say on it overall. Voice acting is all right, though. The graphics are okay. I think that it's kind of a shame that we didn't get animated portraits, because the tech was obviously there. I mean, this came out 2 years after Brood War. I don't know why we didn't get them, at least for like our heroes or story characters or whatever. Generally, I think that maybe the graphics could have used a bit more personality, again, a bit more pizzazz to make them separate from everything else. But the art style seems to be mostly intact. There are a couple of terrain assets, like the Dark Elven Keep in, I don't even remember what mission it was. There's one keep that you know is obviously like feels very distinct from the other assets, and usually these are terrain assets like the pyramids as well. Felt like they didn't really fit with the environment that they were in. Fun fact though, that not the Dark Elven Keep, but in Yurm, the final mission where we're sieging the Dark Elves, that's, I forget what that even is. I think that asset is, some of those assets are used in the second and third games for the Fey race. So you can take a look at those if you're interested. Those are turbofags. So that's it for the presentation. Let's talk about the gameplay. So the AI in this game, they are my first concern. Always my first concern when it comes to gameplay. Like, short of some catastrophic issue with your user interface, where the player cannot actually interact with the game, which you don't really see very often, AI are always my first concern. And so as long as your user interface is at least moderately functional, you should have a situation where, like, you work on your AI, make sure your AI works, because that's what the player is going to be interacting with most of the time. Now, one thing that immediately jumps off the page when you play this game is that the AI stutters their units, even on the hard difficulty, for several seconds. Sometimes they won't even react to being attacked, like the hero when it's like receiving orders. And I don't know what could be possibly, like, what could possibly be the problem here? What are they, like, trying to go through a decision tree or something? Because pretty sure that tech wasn't even out there. Certainly I don't think it was very common, and so I can't imagine what it's receiving, like what instructions it's receiving to stop it from responding to being attacked. You know what I mean? Like, this is not like a Brood War iScript issue. This is not like, I don't even know what else you would say. Like, it's not like we're running out of fucking memory, obviously. So I couldn't tell you what's happening there. It's very consistent, though. It happens all the time, and to think that they didn't fix that is just, I shudder to think what else went unfixed. But yeah, I don't know. I was just kissing enemy heroes left and right, and a lot of times they would not respond, or they would attack once and then stop again. It's just, I don't know what's happening. Neither do they. Speaking of attacking enemy heroes with my hero, it seems like it's very easy to twink out a character by making it so that they have a lot of dexterity, or they have access to really bullshit spells. We got destroyed by a lot of spells where they would literally one-shot my hero from like 400 HP, and I don't know why that is. I have my suspicions that the most efficient class is actually a mage, because you can just like incinerate buildings as well as units. Like, I'm pretty sure that Pillar of Fire or whatever that spell was being cast that destroyed all of our characters and stuff a lot of the time. I'm pretty sure that not only was that responsible for the majority of my deaths, if I had to guess, especially if you take out that Dark Elven map where there was like the orc wall, and I solved it by taking my Dryad and my hero and tisming it through the I can't even think about that one. So I think if you take out that mission, I think the majority of my deaths were from that Pillar of Fire spell. So I'm pretty sure since that, I'm 100% sure that affects buildings as well as units. So it might be the most efficient class. Who knows? You know, like a high health pool mage is probably really busted in that game. And so, yeah, maybe we'll try that for the second title. I don't know. But yeah, just very bizarre. And no gameplay read or anything. It's just one-click damage everything in the surrounding area. Just great. Fantastic. It's fucking worse than Stasis Field. So, yeah. Character customization in this, I feel like, was a major pain point. Could have been vastly improved. And I don't know why it wasn't. Like, it feels like your options are very limited. And I don't know. I don't really have many ideas to improve that right now. Like, off the top of my head, it's just like you need to change all the spells to make it so that they're actually like good for one, like good for skill-based expression. There's that magic missile, I think, or whatever it's called, is the one where it gives your hero a ranged attack, and that got enemy heroes killed more often than not because they would just be stuck behind a mine trying to hit me, and it wasn't converted, or it was converted by me or something. So they would just be attacking it. Fuck, that was pretty funny at least, but I don't think it was intentional. So yeah, I guess that's it about the hero stuff. I mean, once your hero becomes strong enough, you're basically the only kind of expression that you can get is using your hero to kill enemy, bases and stuff. And especially since the infinite resources stuff that I talked about earlier with AI cheats, missions either end very early on by rushing the AI, or they get past a point of no return where it's inevitable that you lose unless you're able to pull out some miracle play, just because of how many units the AI is able to throw at you. And I think if it were not for the cheating nature of the AI, it might actually be more fun to stuff your hero in a tower or something, and then just use like generals from your retinue as for conversions, and then just use the main faction, like actually build units like a real RTS. Unfortunately, a lot of the factions felt very similar to one another, especially all the elves seem to just be reskins. Maybe there's some differences with the casters or something. But I feel like playing the game as a conventional RTS would be more enjoyable than using your hero at all, besides maybe to convert your starting mines or something. And so that's sort of my takeaway there. Like, I wonder if there's like a custom game mode or something that people have been playing around with where they just, put the hero in the tower or just disable heroes entirely and make it so that you have to play it with starting mines already converted, or what you get to keep the retinue idea and then you just bring some generals or something. I have to wonder if that's in the cards at all for the way that this multiplayer ended up playing out, because I can't imagine heroes being enjoyable. I imagine they're actually quite toxic for general gameplay interactions, especially since, guy with more points and spells is just able to one-shot you. So I don't know how anybody's ever fixed that, but that's something. So level design in this game is something else that I'll talk about for a bit. It's very, very poor. You either have scout-free early games because of pre-placed trash everywhere, like the mission that I talked about earlier, where there's orcs, like a wall of orc towers and units that just are pre-placed between you and the dark elven enemy. Or there are enemies that can be gamed early on, where you just, again, rush the AI that way, and you just destroy them that way. There's never much of an in-between. I think the closest thing we had to something that was like that was probably the final mission of the bad campaign, where we actually had to actively fight the enemies, and I didn't know what was going to happen. Like, I didn't know what the map's layout was, so I made some goofy early decisions or just inefficient ones. But even so, I wish that there were more free-for-all missions like that. I wish there were more missions where there was just larger scale stuff going on. Like there was a Minotaur one, but your solution to that was just moving your hero from point A to point B to point C, and then you're done. So it's very bizarre. I definitely think that the scale could have been improved, could have been increased, could have had more enemies flying around, made the AI not cheat, and then you would have had a fairly strong basis for an interesting fantasy RTS. But unfortunately, very little of that was actually done. So whatever. I felt like the level design was really, really poor. And then you had like those obligatory micro boat missions for some reason. I don't know what the fuck was going on there. There was way too many macro list missions, complete micro missions. Obviously the idea that you have these options to play these like really crazy strategies where you just, twink out your hero and go nuts. I feel like that's really bad for how memorable the factions themselves are to play as, because there are a couple of early missions as early as like chapter 3 or whatever in the good and bad campaigns where I was still spamming out knights, spamming out all of the orc units, but at the end of the day it didn't feel like it was ever worth doing that once your hero got past a certain point of strength where they could just one-shot towers and stuff like that with very little in the way of like risk. I was actually surprised about the number of races and factions that you were able to command. Like, I didn't think that barbarians would make an appearance, for example. I was pretty surprised when I saw them in I think it was the final mission of the bad campaign. That was also a weird mission. I think maybe that was pretty close to having an actual RTS mission, but very bizarre. And again, our hero was so strong that we could just one-shot everything. So I'm not really 100% sure what to make of that overall, but I feel like a lot of the races themselves felt too similar. And again, the hero play is such a major focus that you don't really bother with them after a certain point in the campaign, or you end up losing on the hard difficulty anyways. I think that the similarity between the factions is rectified in later installments, particularly if the lack of unique assets being used for a lot of the things, where like the barbarians, orcs, and minotaurs all use ziggurats, and the undead dwarves and humans use palaces, and then all of the elven factions use the Mystic Tower. I felt like that was really bad, but I'm pretty sure that's rectified in the second game, and certainly is rectified in the third game, and there's also like fucking 16 different races in the third game, so it's pretty crazy. But yeah, I was surprised that there were so many in already in the first game, though disappointed at the lack of custom assets. It felt like a lot of them were just thrown together out of nowhere, right? Like I think the Minotaur and the barbarians both use arenas in addition to orcs, so that was like a particular point of contention. I think corrals are used in Minotaur and barbarian, and yeah, just a little tidbit of just laziness, I guess, is like the best way to describe that. I also wish that I had a bit more control over which side I was going to use. Basically, the idea that before you start a mission, you can select which race you're going to be, and then you select your starting retinue, like out of your retinue and your race's starting units that you can pick based on your military points. That would have been pretty useful, and I feel like then you could have had more talents like the Knight Commander talent, which is a complete waste after a certain point anyways. But you could have actually had more of that, or maybe make it so that the Knight Commander also applies to other infantry for other races. Like you get Cavalry Commander, not infantry. You get Cavalry Commander as a talent instead of Knight Commander. That also would have rectified that particular issue. But just in general, I would have preferred to be able to stick with the human faction instead of changing to dwarves or something like that. Like maybe I want to stick with the humans, or maybe I want to use dwarves for longer than I got to instead of using wood elves or something like that, So yeah, I really wish there was a bit more in the way of freedom with that particular thing. Generally, it feels like the story is pretty railroaded. Like again, the story mandates what you're able to do and what gameplay decisions you're able to make and stuff like that. And I feel like that if it was a bit less linear in that respect, a bit less railroaded, then there would be more opportunity for player expression. I guess in a sort of broad strokes discussion on the gameplay elements, there's a lot of moving parts, and I feel like there wasn't enough effort put into any one thing to see any degree of excellence within that. Like, you don't really have any one element of the game that feels really, really well integrated with everything else, because there's a lot of ideas here and not a whole lot of effort put into each individual idea, each individual element. And for example, like you have the conversion mechanic, right? But that can be really easily abused, like in the King's Road mission in the third video. That is a very obvious issue where your command radius is so big because of the way that you've twinked out your character that you can basically convert stuff. You can convert most of their base, or at least like a quarter of their base, from across the river from complete safety. Like they can't possibly stop you because of the way that the AI handles that. Like they cross the bridge instead of trying to fire at you or whatever. You can sort of fix that with AI improvements, but you could also fix that by making it so that it's a little bit more reasonable. Like maybe instead of bothering with increasing your command radius past a certain cap, it instead increases the speed at which you convert for whatever is left over or something. I don't know. That still would be a little, unintuitive, but would have been something better than what we got. I guess the conversion mechanic is okay overall. I feel like the abuse cases leave it open to mockery. And of course the recruit, the retinue or whatever, that area of gameplay, I feel like it does allow you to better express what your preferences are as a player, but I wish that the game's way of deciding which factions you were going to have, which units you were going to be able to incorporate into your retinue was telegraphed a bit more. Like sometimes it's based on what you've built, and other times it just randomly selects based on I feel like it is actually just RNG. Like sometimes you get a white mage even though you're playing as orcs or whatever. Like I don't understand what's happening there. Like what can I do to improve my chances of getting units that I want besides building them? And I don't really know what the actual work is behind the scenes, what the algorithms are deciding for me behind the scenes. But if I knew that, and if it was intuitive, then it would be, I think, a better way to express skill, because in earlier missions, you'd be able to build certain things that would provide you with a better chance to get a desirable retinue later on. Like, imagine this in the context of competitive play, where you actually have the retinue mechanic. Like, players are able to start out with a basic kind of retinue, or like they don't have anything starting out with a retinue besides maybe one general, and it's a best of 5, so you have to win 3 games. And then across the games, they get more units for their retinue, right? Like, you don't really want them RNGing it. Like, this isn't fucking Hearthstone. And so I feel like if there was a way to make it so that the units that player built and the maybe there's some element of player choice, like you could choose what kind of mercenaries to bring in or something, and that determine, or I guess that'd be like the quest rewards or something, determines like what other non your race, units that you end up getting. I think that could be really interesting. Of course, you'd have to axe the heroes, but still, it could be interesting. And so I'm not really sure what to make of that, but I feel like there was a lot of potential there that we didn't end up getting to explore because we didn't really understand how the system worked, and the game never attempted to explain that. So I would say that the retinue mechanic, overall, it seemed fine. Like, it seemed like it played out well enough, but there's a lot more potential with it, and especially since it's supposed to be this like linear railroaded story or whatever, like you'd think that there would at least be some element of player expression based on the kind of stuff that we could build in order to give us a better chance of getting the retinue we wanted, and we didn't really ever get to do that, at least not for units that weren't of our race. So yeah, I guess that's really the extent of my rant on the retinue stuff. Putting workers in mines seemed sort of natural, I guess. Maybe it's just because I knew how it worked already. It worked as a way of having workers improve your economy, but my issue with it is that they don't cost supply once they go into the mines, and the army limit overall was like encountered maybe twice or 3 times in the entire playthrough. It didn't feel like it was a main pain point. Again, partially because playing with your hero is all you really need for the most part, but I feel like they should still contribute towards your army limit when you have them in the mines, because then it's a trade-off. Instead of choosing to build, for example, more units with that army limit, you're choosing to improve your economy, and you have to balance that out, right? It's sort of like a mini upkeep system or something. I don't know. I feel like that would have been a more intelligent way to handle the system than whatever the hell that they did. I don't even know if workers even count towards the army limit at all. I assume they do, but maybe they don't, period. And that would also be a decision that I would disagree with if they don't cost army supply or whatever at all. I guess the user interface overall was pretty poor, though. Selecting individual units was pretty bad or arduous due to the fact that they had a very small card in the command card area, the unit info pane, whatever you want to call it. And it seemed like we had mouse inaccuracy or something. Like, it was really hard for me to select individual units. It might be because of the game speed. It might be because of the like really large hitboxes or something, so it's hard to make precise clicks. Just in general, it didn't feel like it was a great system. And so I feel like there could have been some improvements there. Maybe make it so that every unit takes up the same space in the command card or the unit info pane when you have group select, and you limit the army selection a bit more reasonably, and then you eliminate a lot of variants like that. Like, I actually feel like it's a lot easier to control orc armies because they have more units that are in the 2, like they take up 2 slots in a transport or whatever, so they take up 2 slots in your card as well, your selection window. Like, it's certainly a lot easier to select Grant than it is to select anything else. And if you're not willing to, put out a bunch of individual control groups, then, especially with our armies that get as big as this game allows you to make your armies, I feel like it's a little unreasonable to expect you to have so many control groups of so many units. Especially since you just want to grab a low health one or whatever. You're not going to have that one in a different control group because you don't know which units are going to get focused down before the battle already starts. So it's a little weird in that respect. I wish that it was a little bit better. And I think it naturally lends to a racial imbalance. Not that that really matters because this game isn't particularly competitive, but you get the idea. Like, it could be a problem if you were trying to make it a competitive game. I guess the last thing that we'll talk about is the quest system and the spellcasting overall. The quest system I felt like was really underwhelming. The rewards that you got were just boring or useless, like especially the items. And the units I usually just suicided. I didn't really give a shit about. Although I guess that has the added bonus of them, even if they die for some reason, they still end up in your retinue. So I guess that was kind of cool. And sort of adds to the amount of player choice, although it is RNG whether or not you get a unit-based quest. I like the idea of a quest system overall. I feel like it should just provide better rewards and also require more difficult tasks. And like, imagine if it gave you permanent bonuses or much better items or ability points or something like that, as opposed to what it did give you instead, which was just basic shit, right? And if the tasks that you required of you were much tougher, I feel like that would be pretty cool too. For unit spellcasting, which is separate from hero spellcasting, I thought the unit spellcasting in general was really weird because of the fact that we didn't even have to have the unit selected. We just had to hit like shift plus whatever the hotkey was, and then the spell was cast. So I don't know how it picked like units in terms of like which unit in particular was doing it, right? Like, I guess if you had a unit selected and you cast the spell, it would cast it with that unit that you had selected. But does it go off of what you've last had selected? Does it go off of what's closest to the center of your screen or your cursor? Like, I don't know. It's not very intuitive. So I don't know what's up with that. I feel like it should have just, required you to control group or whatever. And it also has smart casting, I'm pretty sure too, which is something that I don't think should be done. I feel like you should punish players who have less precise control. But you weren't even required to have the unit selected here, so there wasn't even an inkling of punishment or reward for poor or better than poor control. So I don't know what to make of that. It's just weird. And hero spellcasting is something we didn't really do, but it does require going into a sub menu, like a spell book. I don't think you can bind individual spells in that, but I guess I'm not sure. That'll be something that I experiment with in the second game probably. But the spell book was just in general, I feel like it's very clunky if you have to open up a sub menu in general. I feel like that should just be part of the command card. Of course, there's not really a whole lot of options for that. But even if it was like, you press this button to open up another part of the command card, similar to like buildings in StarCraft, I feel like that would still be something. It would be better than opening up a new menu or whatever. So not much to say there. My final thoughts overall on Battlecry are that it doesn't really hold up, certainly, despite the nostalgia. It was pretty funny to play. Like, it was certainly a very peculiar game. I feel like it has some personality, just unintentional personality, right? Like, whatever it tries to do, it doesn't do well. And whatever enjoyment we got out of it, I think, was mostly unintentional. So not much you can say in its favor, besides the fact that it has a little bit of character as a game, not too much character in terms of the like moving parts within it. But again, that could just be my nostalgia talking. Maybe there's nothing worth getting worked up over at all in this title whatsoever. But I'm hoping for better gameplay in the future installments. I'm pretty sure that there is better gameplay in the future installments. I'm hoping for campier cutscenes, but I don't even know if there are any cutscenes in the other productions. And I guess overall, I don't recommend playing this game. The second and third ones are more robust and better overall. It's certainly more feature complete. I guess if you want a story-driven experience, because the second one is a bit more freeform and the third one is it's story-driven, but in a very different way. If you want a more conventional campaign, then maybe this isn't too bad. Like, it's okay to play once or twice, but it's generally not memorable. It's certainly not very accessible given its age, and it offers less customizability and less player expression in general. So I just wouldn't recommend it, but if you really have a boner for Battlecry, then maybe you'll like it in general. But I guess that's that. That's really all I have to say. A whopping fucking 40 plus minutes of a review for a game that came out in the year 2000. So I hope you enjoyed. Hope you enjoyed the production. We'll be playing the second game pretty soon, and then the third game. And that's it, because the fourth game is like not even the same. It's not Battlecry. It's just like, actually, I don't even know what it is. It's like a turn-based game. I don't play those. Those are for gays. Bye.